Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're cracking open a stack of truly fascinating documents, excerpts from a series of articles originally published over 100 years ago, between 1906 and 1915, called Moments with Friends.
Yeah, and these aren't your typical historical articles, are they? Think of them more like a deep window into a very specific worldview from that era. It's one that blends philosophy, esotericism, and some pretty sharp critiques of contemporary movements back then.
Exactly. They tackle timeless questions about life, the universe, human nature, but through this, well, unique lens.
Definitely unique.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack these sources together, pull out the most important and, frankly, surprising nuggets, and really try to understand the particular perspective they offer on everything from healing and the afterlife to consciousness and, the very nature of reality.
In Critically, we're sticking only to what's right here in these pages. No outside interpretation, just what the text says.
Right. It's going to be a fascinating journey into a different way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. So right off the bat, these sources spend a lot of time grappling with the idea of healing physical ills. And they draw a pretty clear line, don't they, between what they see as physical and what they call mental or spiritual means of healing.
That's right. According to this text, figures like Jesus and the saints did heal the sick using mental means, and, that wasn't considered wrong for them. A key point they make is that Jesus and his disciples initially didn't receive any money for their cures.
Initially.
Right. Though, interestingly, later the text notes that Jesus said the laborer is worthy of his hire, which they say was then accepted as authority for clergy to accept pay.
Okay, and that leads them to a pretty pointed critique, doesn't it? Specifically about Christian scientists accepting compensation for healing back then.
Oh, absolutely. The source really zeroes in on this. It asks, basically, if Christian scientists claim they aren't using the human mind, but a divine mind, then, well, how does the divine mind act without the human mind prompting it?
Good question.
And furthermore, if the divine mind is acting directly, why is the Christian scientist even needed in the first place? Seems logical, their line of questioning.
Yeah.
They find it particularly unsaintly, that's their word, to charge so much per visit, cure or no cure. They contrast this really sharply with how Jesus and his disciples operated, at least initially.
So the criticism is...
It's pretty clear. Christian scientists, in the source's view, are accepting pay like clergy while ignoring core Christian church doctrines. They frame it as, well, basically, if God or spiritual means is what affects the cure, then it's a gift of the Spirit. And accepting money for it amounts to obtaining that gift under false pretenses. That's the charge.
Wow, strong words. And there's a really provocative speculation made here too, isn't there?
Yes, very provocative. The text suggests that if the possibility of making money were removed from teaching these doctrines or attempting cures, this whole Christian Science cult, as they call it, might just cease to exist. They think the moneymakers would lose interest, naturally, and perhaps the faith of believers might be shattered without that physical basis, meaning the physical act, and apparent success of healing to ground it.
It's a very direct challenge to that specific movement at the time.
Extremely direct. But beyond that specific critique, the sources do lay out a broader principle for healing in general.
Right.
Physical ills that have clear physical causes, like cuts, broken bones, or diseases they link to improper food or neglect, like consumption, diabetes, or gout, those should be treated by physical means. Proper care, wholesome food, that sort of thing.
Okay, makes sense. Physical problem, physical solution. What about the other kind they mentioned?
Right. So for physical ills that they attribute to mental causes, things like nervousness or diseases they say stem from narcotics, alcohol, or what they call immoral thoughts and acts, well, those should be treated differently. The focus shifts. You need to remove the mental cause first, and then assist nature with healthy practices, wholesome food, water, air, sunlight. And they also add that the motive of the healer is considered very important in their framework.
Okay, interesting distinction. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and specific. These sources present a particular treatment for cancer and other so-called incurable diseases, something called the Salisbury treatment. What on earth does that mean?
It's remarkably simple as described here. Basically, eating well-broiled lean beef, making absolutely sure to remove all fat and fiber,
Okay.
and drinking hot water, but specifically not near meal times.
That sounds Quite different from anything we'd hear today. What do the sources claim about its effectiveness?
They claim this treatment precisely because it's simple and inexpensive, and thus, in their view, unfavored by many physicians at the time, actually strikes at the roots and affects cures.
What's the mechanism?
The mechanism they describe is that it starves the disease while simultaneously nourishing the body, but they add another layer to it. They say it also affects what they call the astral body and trains the mind because it requires serious determination and will to stick to it.
Ah, so it's not just physical then. It's got this mental and even sort of spiritual component.
Exactly. The underlying idea presented is that a harmonious relation between the body and mind is what prevents disease in the first place. And things like cancer germs or cells, they say, only cause disease if the body's constitution isn't strong enough to handle them. This treatment is meant to restore that strength and harmony.
Fascinating. They also touch on diet more broadly, right? Like what our bodies are naturally built for.
Yes, they do. They look at teeth as an indicator, and based on that, they suggest man is naturally about 2/3 carnivorous and 1/3 herbivorous.
Okay.
And they make a really strong case against exclusive vegetarianism. They claim it causes fermentation, yeast, and gas,
Right.
which they say leads to many diseases. An unsettled mind, oversensitiveness, and even, get this, tendency to mediumship.
Tendency to mediumship
Yeah.
just from eating vegetables.
That's what the source claims. Seriously. Conversely, they argue eating meat supplies natural force, building a strong, healthy, physical animal body, and this strong body serves as a kind of fortress for the mind against external physical personalities.
Wow. So the body as a literal defense mechanism influenced by diet.
A very particular view, yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving from the physical body and healing to something much more fundamental.
Oh.
The fabric of existence itself. These sources have a really unique perspective on the nature of reality.
They really do. They start with darkness, and they say darkness isn't just, an absence of light. It's a homogeneous substance, the very root or background of all manifestation. It's described as quiet, unconscious, undisturbed.
Okay, so there's passive darkness and then light.
Light, then, is presented as a power emanating from what they call intelligences.
Intelligences.
Okay.
So you have this inert darkness and then light, a power from intelligences. What happens when they interact?
Well, according to the text, when this light hits the darkness becomes active and dual. And this activated state is what they call spirit matter.
Spirit matter.
One thing. Yeah, spirit and matter aren't presented as separate things that come together. They're seen as opposite aspects or poles of this one original substance when it's in action.
Got it. And this spirit matter exists on different levels or planes.
Precisely. They talk about different planes of matter, and on each plane, the substance is considered matter when it's passive and it's force when it becomes active.
Okay.
So physical matter is the passive state on our plane, right?
Yeah.
And physical force is just active physical matter. The same principle applies to the astral plane. Astral matter is the passive state there. And force on the astral plane is active astral matter. It's a consistent pattern.
Can you give an example? They use a scientific one from the time, don't they?
Yes, they use radium and radioactivity, which was cutting-edge stuff back then. They argue that radium, the physical element itself, isn't the force. It's just the medium through which a force radioactivity manifests.
The radioactivity is.
Radioactivity, in their view, is astral matter in action.
So the rock itself is physical matter, but the energy it gives off is this finer astral matter.
That's exactly how they present it. They say this force comes from a source unknown to modern science at the time, just like, the source of electricity manifesting through a wire isn't the wire itself, it's just the channel.
Mm-hmm.
And they describe astral matter as much finer than physical matter, interpenetrating it, like ether maybe, or electricity existing within water. It's there, but on a different level.
Okay, that's a complex framework. Let's shift to a term that causes a lot of confusion even today.
Yeah.
Soul. These sources wade right into that, don't they?
They absolutely do. And they acknowledge up front that the term is used in tons of different ways. Ancient Egyptian concepts of 7 souls, Plato's 3 parts, the Christian distinction between soul, spirit, and body, various Hindu ideas. They see the mess.
Right. They even mention theosophical writers differing amongst themselves.
Exactly, distinguishing divine soul, human soul, animal soul. It gets complicated. They mention 7 orders of souls on 4 planes, ascending and descending, a soul connected to everything, basically holding the changing body together.
So, given all that acknowledged complexity, what's their specific definition or distinction that's key for us trying to understand these texts?
The crucial distinction they make, the one you really need to grasp for these sources, is between the human soul and the mind. According to them, the mind. The mind is inherently immortal,
Okay, the mind is immortal.
but the human soul is not immortal.
Not immortal, automatically. That's a twist.
Not inherently, no. The human soul may become immortal, but it's conditional. They explain it like this. A portion of the mind, which they refer to as the incarnation, or sometimes reincarnation, connects with, or you might say, descends into the human soul and the physical body.
Right.
Now, if the soul offers less resistance to the mind, if it aligns itself, and the mind is successful in its purpose during that life, then the mind effectively raises the human soul from its mortal state to an immortal one.
So the human soul's immortality isn't a given. It's something achieved, earned almost, through the mind's influence during life.
That's precisely the mechanism described in these sources. It's an active process, not a default state.
Okay, so what about after death then? What happens to this human soul, especially if it hasn't achieved that immortality?
The sources suggest that if the human soul hasn't been able to distinguish itself from its desires during life, it might go through a kind of metamorphosis after death, like a butterfly. It becomes inactive, like a cocoon, perhaps as a way to process and realize its condition.
And if it had distinguished itself from desires?
Well, if a soul was able to distinguish itself from the animal, their term for the desire nature, it would refuse further connection with those lower elements after death. It would be free, in a sense.
This naturally leads them to discuss appearances at seances, which were hugely popular around the time these were written. What's their take on that phenomenon?
Yeah, they tackle it head on. They say it's not strictly impossible for a genuine human soul to appear at a seance, but it's highly improbable.
Why improbable?
Two main reasons given. First, they claim the sitters, the people attending the seance, usually don't know the proper methods or conditions required to actually evoke a true soul. Second, even if they did, it would apparently require an incredibly intense, focused desire from both the living participants and the discarnated soul itself, a rare combination.
So if it's usually not the actual soul, what are people typically seeing or communicating with then, according to these sources?
They argue quite strongly that the appearances at seances are usually not the souls of the departed loved ones. Instead, they're what the text calls shells, spooks, and entities devoid of manas. Manas being their term for that human soul aspect connected to the immortal mind.
Shells and spooks. Okay. Any more detail?
Yes, specifically, they often refer to them as desire forms, or using the Sanskrit term kamarupa.
Desire forms, like echoes of the person's leftover desire.
Exactly like that. They describe these desire forms as being temporary prisoners of the lower astral plane, essentially just echoing old instincts, habits, and longings from the life just lived.
And you can tell us one of these how.
They give indicators. These forms tend to jump between topics erratically. They lack real reason and lucidity. And if you press them with direct consecutive questions, they often fall into nonsensical chattering. They have the cunning of the animal, as the text puts it. They'll elude questions, maybe claim time is up, or the conditions aren't right, or just say, I don't know how to reply, to avoid being pinned down logically.
Whereas a real discarnated human soul, if one actually appeared, would be totally different.
Completely different, they argue. A true discarnated human soul, communicating consciously, would be direct, lucid, coherent. And importantly, its communication would likely be of moral, ethical, or spiritual worth, not just chit-chat about commonplace matters or earthly affairs.
That's a pretty clear, if maybe difficult to apply, test for psychic phenomena. What about philosophical or spiritual teachings sometimes received through mediums? Could those come from these desire forms too?
They suggest those kinds of higher teachings could come from several potential sources, not typically the desire forms. It might be the medium's own higher self or ego communicating subconsciously. Or possibly a living wise person projecting their thoughts, someone who has learned to consciously separate their mind from their physical body. Or perhaps someone who has departed but hasn't yet fully dissociated from their desire body and wasn't subject to the usual coma-like state they describe after death. Rare cases, it seems.
Speaking of the after-death state, what's the general experience for the ordinary human, according to these sources, beyond the seance question?
For the ordinary person, the state immediately after death is primarily described as a time for rest, not for work or activity. It's seen as preparatory, a consolidation phase, before eventually returning to the world for more work.
So Earth is the main place for work.
Yes, Earth, in this view, is the primary place for spiritual labor, learning, and development. They do say that those few who have attained immortality may choose to work after death, either for specific individual goals or maybe for the good of humanity as a whole. But for most, it's rest.
And they describe different levels or worlds someone might inhabit after death.
They do. They talk about a world of thought, which they say is where man truly lives, his real home, even while he's in a physical body. And between this higher thought world and our physical world, there's an intermediate realm, the desire world, which they also call by the Sanskrit term kamaloka.
Kamaloka,
Okay.
seat of desires.
Exactly. The seat of passions, gross desires, the stuff the mind needs to disentangle from. After death, the mind must free itself from this desire body, this kama loka entanglement, if it's going to experience any real rest or enjoyment in the thought world.
And if it can't?
Well, they describe rare cases where the mind remains enslaved by the desire body. In such cases, the entity might appear drugged or intoxicated, completely dominated by base desires, resembling, say, a drunkard obsessed with drink. They reiterate that in very few such apparitions is the actual mind, the immortal principle, truly present or in control.
What about positive connections, like family?
That's interesting. They say if the mind while living held ideals like family or community strongly, it maintains these ideals in the after-death thought world. There, the ideal itself becomes the real, and the specific physical manifestation from the past life fades or becomes abstract. The connection shifts to the level of pure thought or ideal.
Okay, let's pivot now to human potential, karma, and inner development, again through the lens of these fascinating sources. They discuss destiny and karma, defining karma quite simply, right?
Yeah, pretty straightforwardly. Karma is simply the result of past thoughts and actions. What you have thought and done is your destiny, at least for a certain period, essentially, for your current lifetime.
So the circumstances of your life aren't random.
Not at all, according to this. They suggest that influences present at your birth are like indicators, signposts pointing back to those past actions and giving you a blueprint of what to expect in the present life. The birth moment itself, they say, must coincide and cooperate with the karma of that life. It's all interconnected.
So destiny isn't something arbitrary imposed from outside, but a direct consequence of our own past.
That's the view presented, yes, and they link this directly to free will. Free will, in their view, isn't just whimsical wishing or wanting things. It's the conscious act of deciding what one shall do, making deliberate choices.
And how does that relate to fulfilling karma?
Well, an honest person, in their framework, fulfills their karma, the contract they essentially made through past actions. If that contract involves undesirable experiences, the lesson is to learn from it so you don't make another similar contract in the future. Karma, or fate, is viewed as this self-made contract, which they insist is ultimately just, even if it involves suffering.
Okay. Now, they also have a really fascinating and maybe a bit strange to modern ears idea about man having the nature of every animal in the world within him. What's that about?
Yeah, that one takes a minute to unpack. It's a deeply symbolic idea. They're saying that each distinct animal type represents a particular desire found within the human psyche.
So, like, greed is a wolf, anger is a tiger.
Kind of, yeah. While man's overall type is human, these underlying animal natures, these desires, show themselves when passions take hold. They give examples. You might see the wolf looking out in someone's expression, maybe greed or cunning. The tiger panting, fierceness, rage. The snake hissing, slyness, deceit. Or the lion roaring, anger, dominance. Our desires manifest these animalistic qualities.
So it's metaphorical, about our desires having animalistic traits.
Yes, but it goes further than just metaphor for them. They claim that when a person thinks strongly in the nature of an animal meaning, when they intensely entertain and identify with one of these powerful animalistic desires, they actively create the thought of that animal.
Create the thought.
And these thoughts aren't just inert puffs of smoke. They believe these thoughts live, they have substance in what they call a life world, and they actually contribute to giving form to entities that are coming into existence. They state very clearly that thought is considered the ultimate creator of all forms, and man is unique because he's the only animal, in their view, who truly thinks in this creative way.
So human thoughts literally shape forms, potentially even physical forms, in the universe. That's a huge claim.
It's a massive claim, absolutely. And this connects directly to another really intriguing point they make about how man is said to cause animal appearances, which they link to ancient ideas about transmigration, or souls being reborn as animals.
Oh, right, transmigration. How do they explain that?
It's not quite the simple idea of a human soul just popping into a dog's body. It's specifically tied to desire. During life, they say, desire is this constantly changing, manifold animal principle within us, without a single fixed form. But crucially, at the moment of death, this churning mass of desire fixes or crystallizes into one definite animal type, the one that was most dominant or characteristic of the person's desire life.
The dominant desire takes an animal form.
Exactly. It might retain a sort of human-like astral form briefly, but after the mind, the immortal part departs, they say this desire form loses the human outline and takes on its true dominant animal type.
And this fixed desire animal is what gets reborn.
Yes, according to these sources. This fixed animal desire form then coalesces or merges with the specific thought form tag that the person, and maybe others, created for it during life through similar patterns of desire thinking. And that combined entity is eventually born through a physical animal body of its corresponding kind. So this, they argue, is the real meaning behind ancient scriptures mentioning transmigration into animal bodies. It's not the whole soul, but the fixed, crystallized desire nature at death determining the subsequent animal form.
That is a very specific and unusual take on transmigration.
It really is. It's quite detailed. And they kind of extend this idea, saying the entire world, in a way, is a reflection of the likes and dislikes of man. These desires are born within us, then manifested outwardly, and they spread, creating more similar likes and dislikes in others. It's presented as a kind of feedback loop driven by human desire and thought shaping reality.
Okay, given all these different, sometimes conflicting ideas floating around, how do these sources suggest we navigate differing opinions to find what's actually true?
That's a great question. They make a key distinction here. There's the abstract one truth, the ultimate reality, which they say cannot actually be proven or fully grasped by the human mind in its current state. But then there's a truth about specific things within the manifested universe, and that, they say, we can understand.
What are the steps?
They describe 3 stages of understanding. First, there's ignorance, which they equate with darkness. Then there's the stage of opinion or belief, which they call the middle world. And finally, there's knowledge, which is seeing truth as it is, equated with light.
And most people are stuck in opinion.
Exactly. Opinion is the state where the mind can't clearly see the truth of something. It gets confused, often mistaking the thing itself for its reflection or shadow. To move out of this realm of opinion, they say you have to learn to consciously distinguish between the light, the source of knowing, the object itself, and its reflection or shadow.
So analyzing the situation carefully.
Right. Right opinion, in their view, correctly distinguishes the thing from its shadow. Wrong opinion mistakes the shadow for the substance. And the key to developing right opinions, they emphasize, is to free the mind from prejudice and also from the misleading influence of the mere senses.
So it requires active mental work and self-awareness.
Absolutely. Thought and dedicated mental training are necessary. They also say that holding on to a right opinion, really sticking with it, even when it goes against your immediate self-interest or comfort, is what moves the mind towards knowledge.
And the state of knowledge is different.
Very different. In the state of knowledge, the mind perceives the thing directly, as it is, illuminated by a light of knowledge, which is apparently self-proving. You just know. And interestingly, they claim that once true knowledge is attained, the kind of discursive thinking, reasoning about something to figure it out actually stops. The search is over.
That's a powerful description of achieving certainty. What about thought transference? They talk about that too.
Yes, they accept it as possible, but say we generally don't do it accurately because we haven't learned the language of thought.
There's a specific language of thought, like grammar and vocabulary.
Apparently so, according to these sources. To send a thought accurately, they say you need several things. First, control over your own mental functions. Second, the ability to hold your mind steadily focused on a single subject. Third, allowing the mind to really carve out the form of that subject, almost like mentally sculpting it. And finally, you have to consciously will that formed thought to the recipient.
Wow, that sounds like it requires incredible mental discipline.
It certainly does. And receiving thoughts accurately requires similar mental control and what they describe as attentive listening with the mind, being receptive but focused.
Okay. They also have a point about getting a thought out of your mind. It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They say trying to get a thought out by sheer force of will is impossible. Why? Because the very act of giving attention to the thought, even negative attention, like I must not think this, is precisely what keeps it lodged there.
Right.
They allude to an old story, The Great Green Bear, which perfectly illustrates this. If someone tells you not to think of a great green bear, that's instantly all you can think about.
Ah, the classic mental trap. Don't think of a pink elephant.
Exactly that. So the implication isn't to fight the unwanted thought directly, but to simply withdraw your attention and gently turn it elsewhere. Distraction, not confrontation.
Okay, shifting gears completely. Can you get something for nothing? What do these sources say?
They are absolutely unequivocal on this point. They say everyone inherently feels it's wrong deep down, but people try anyway. Maybe because they see others who seem to succeed without effort, or they believe in simplistic claims about a law of abundance that implies you can just attract things magically.
Oh,
But the sources state flatly it is impossible to get something for nothing in the long run. Life, the universe, operates on a principle of just return. Everything requires an equivalent exchange.
and if you try to circumvent that natural law,
They say trying to get something for nothing fundamentally interferes with the circulation of life and the natural distribution of energy and resources according to universal law. You essentially become an obstruction in the system.
is there a penalty?
Yes. The penalty exacted by nature or law itself is that you must eventually return what was taken, or somehow be suppressed or removed as an obstruction. They do clarify, though, that apparent windfalls like things gained through seeming accident, chance, or even inheritance aren't really something for nothing. They see those as coming from the natural complex working out of karmic law and are considered legitimate within this framework.
Interesting distinction. What about secret societies? They examine those too, right? Popular back then.
Yeah, they address them. And they're quite dismissive of most secret societies. They see the majority as catering to immature minds, people seeking a sense of exclusivity or importance, with secrets that are usually of little actual worth. They compare it to a child's secret game.
Pretty cynical view. But are there any exceptions?
They allow that a few societies might potentially help with genuine spiritual development, but only under specific conditions. If they genuinely promote real knowledge and, crucially, don't cause prejudice or exclusion.
Any examples?
They mention the Masonic Order specifically as one that could potentially benefit members if those members truly penetrated the deeper symbolic, moral, and spiritual teachings embedded in its rituals. But, they claim, most members back then only got superficial business or social benefits from it.
So the potential structure might be there, but people don't necessarily engage with the deeper meaning.
That's precisely their critique, and they argue that secrecy itself isn't actually needed for mature minds seeking real development. The everyday problems and challenges of ordinary life, they insist, are sufficient training ground for genuine inner growth. No secret society, according to these sources, can force mental or spiritual advancement beyond what your own natural development and effort allow.
Makes sense. How do these sources suggest protecting yourself against things like lies and slander?
It's quite profound, actually. They say the only real protection comes entirely from within. It's about cultivating unwavering honesty in your thoughts, absolute truthfulness in your speech, and complete justice in your actions.
Internal qualities are the shield.
Exactly. They present honesty and truthfulness as permanent virtues, inherently strong, whereas lies and slander are impermanent vices, inherently weak. So if your character has vulnerabilities, if there's a seed of dishonest thought or false speech within you, then external attacks like lies and slander will find purchase, they'll stick. But if you are genuinely armored by deep-seated honesty and truthfulness, they say the attacks cannot harm your true self and will actually recoil on the attacker.
Recoil, what does that mean exactly? Like it bounces back?
Yeah, they describe it as a fundamental law in the moral world. The person who injures another through falsehoods will inevitably, sooner or later, suffer similar falsehoods themselves. The penalty might be delayed across lifetimes, perhaps, but it's certain.
Like karma specifically for lies.
Pretty much. And interestingly, they see this recoil as ultimately being better, even for the attacker, because it helps them eventually learn the futility and self-destructive nature of doing wrong. It's a harsh lesson, but a necessary one.
It sounds like a form of almost moral physics.
That's a good way to put it. Finally, in the section, they touch briefly on laughter. They don't just see it as amusement. They describe it as an indicator of character, something driven by the mind's underlying attitude acting on the nervous system.
Does it have a purpose in development?
Yes, they consider it a vital necessity for healthy human development, especially for helping the mind cope with life's inevitable difficulties. Hardship builds endurance, strength, and quickness, they say, but it's laughter that builds poise, ease, and grace. It helps the mind maintain perspective and see the light and cheer even in tough situations.
All right, let's delve into the final sections. How these sources view symbols, elements in ancient lore. They start with the formation of metals, listing the classic seven: tin, gold, mercury, copper, lead, silver, and iron. How do they see them?
Well, these metals aren't just inert chemical elements to them at all. They're seen as precipitated and imprisoned force, light or quality, like solidified energy. And this energy, they say, emanates from the seven classical planets.
So planetary forces condensed into metal.
That's the idea. Earth attracts these forces, which they describe as being living entities, even calling them elemental spirits. The metals essentially give body and form to these planetary forces or spirits.
Wow. Elemental spirits.
Yeah, and the different metals represent different stages or qualities in the evolution of the mineral kingdom, with gold being considered the highest, most perfected stage. They also claim these metals have both life-giving as well as death-dealing qualities, depending entirely on how they are used or misused by humans. And intriguingly, they note that the formation of these metals in the Earth can actually happen quite quickly if the conditions are right, not necessarily taking geological ages.
Fascinating. What about large fires? Things like prairie fires or big city conflagrations. How do these sources explain those beyond, someone dropping a match?
Their explanation is quite elemental, literally. They attribute those massive, uncontrolled fires to the overwhelming presence of the fire element itself being in great force in the atmosphere at that time and place. This fire element dominates the other elements, earth, air, water, and essentially causes widespread ignition.
So the spark, like a campfire or lightning or even arson, isn't the real ultimate cause?
According to these sources, those are just the provocations, the triggers. The main cause, they argue, is the dominant volatile presence of the fire element itself in the atmosphere, making everything ripe for ignition from even a minor catalyst like friction. The flame we see is how the fire element actively enters the world.
That's a very different way to think about wildfires or urban fires.
Yeah.
What about the old tradition of assigning precious stones to months of the year? Birthstones and all that. They touch on that, right?
They do. And while they acknowledge it's often dismissed today as mere fancy or superstition, they suggest this tradition might actually stem from a lost knowledge which once existed concerning the virtues of stones.
Lost knowledge. What kind of virtues?
They see stones, particularly pure gemstones, as being natural centers through which forces of nature act, like little focal points or batteries for subtle energies.
Centers for natural forces.
Okay. Yes, and the purity and specific composition of the stone determine how effective a center it is for particular forces. They suggest that each month brings a certain predominant cosmic or elemental influence, making certain stones temporarily more powerful as centers for channeling those specific forces during that time.
So there might be something to the monthly associations.
Potentially, according to this view. However, they are very quick to add a strong caution. They say that attaching fanciful, made-up virtues to stones or becoming dependent on them for luck or protection is useless and potentially harmful. It distracts the mind from real inner work and makes you dependent on external objects instead of developing your own inner strength and understanding.
So the ancient idea might have had a basis in subtle energies, but the modern practice of just wearing a birthstone for luck is misguided.
That seems to be precisely their view. Now, moving to animal symbolism, the snake is a really potent symbol they discuss. It's presented primarily as a symbol of wisdom.
Wisdom. That's not usually the first thing people associate with a snake. Fear, danger, maybe cunning.
Right. They clarify immediately it's not because the animal itself is particularly intelligent. It's because the snake's physical organism, its unique physiology, allows for the direct action of what they dramatically call the electrical power of the universe.
The electrical power of the universe.
Yes. This is the power that, they say, gives wisdom to humans when they are ready to receive it. But humans, in our current state of evolution, cannot handle this power directly. It's too intense.
How does the snake's body facilitate this? What's special about it?
They point specifically to the snake's spinal column structure, and they draw a direct parallel to humans. In humans, there are coiled, latent nerves, often associated with the base of the spine, what we might call kundalini energy today. These nerves, they say, must be awakened and consciously connected to the spinal cord to access this universal electrical power.
And if that happens?
When this energy is awakened correctly and related properly to the spinal cord, they claim it electrifies the person's astral form body and quite literally illuminates the mind, bestowing wisdom.
That sounds incredibly powerful, but potentially dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. They state very clearly that this power is perilous if a person's nervous system isn't adequately prepared and purified. It can potentially cause severe physical disease, insanity, or even death if awakened prematurely or improperly. They also describe its movement within the body as being snake-like and note that successfully integrating it involves shedding one's old limited self or form, just as a snake sheds its skin.
So handling it requires preparation.
Absolutely. They stress that to handle this power safely, a person must fundamentally overcome fear and learn to love truth above all else. Only then can the wisdom be accessed without destruction.
That adds a whole new profound dimension to the snake symbol. What about the eagle, another common symbol?
The eagle, they say, commonly symbolizes things like strength, endurance, courage, swiftness, and dominion, especially when used by nations or in a worldly, material sense. But spiritually, it's much more. It's seen as one of the four living beings found in esoteric traditions, and it symbolizes the spiritual power in man which may rise to the greatest heights, the soul's ability to soar.
And they link it to alchemy, too.
Yes, they bring in an alchemical reference. They talk about the blood of the red lion, which represents the active, fiery desire nature seated in the blood, and the gluten of the white eagle, representing the cooler, more passive lymph system, or perhaps purified spiritual substance. These two must unite.
Unite how?
Well, they claim that simply gratifying the impulse born from the raw union of these energies, raw desire, actually weakens the lion, the life force, and prevents the eagle, the spiritual potential, from rising. Conversely, consciously restraining or transmuting that raw desire allows the spiritual power, the eagle, to ascend towards true spiritual heights.
That's a fascinating bit of symbolism for the inner struggle between desire and spirit. They also mention ever-burning lamps. Are those real?
They accept the possibility, yes. Things like the legendary ever-burning lamps supposedly used by groups like the Rosicrucians. They suggest the reason we might doubt such things today is simply our limited definition of what constitutes a lamp. We think it must require oil, a wick, combustible matter.
But their definition is broader.
Exactly. A lamp, they say, in a broader, more fundamental sense, is simply that through which light is given or manifested. It doesn't have to be a physical object burning fuel in the way we normally think. You could be something drawing on a different kind of energy.
Semantic shift to allow for possibilities. Okay, they also touch on the specific date of December 25th and the widespread celebration of Savior's birthdays around that time.
Right. They point out that this date, falling around the winter solstice, was already a time of major rejoicing and religious festivals for many ancient cultures, long before Christianity. They list examples: the Egyptians celebrating the birth of Horus, the Chinese celebrating Titian, the Persians celebrating Mithras, the Romans celebrating Bacchus and also Mithras, and Hindus having significant festivals then too.
And their conclusion from this pattern.
They state emphatically that this near-universal timing cannot be dismissed as mere accidents or coincidence.
Implying a deeper, non-coincidental reason.
Precisely. Suggesting there's an underlying truth of deep mystic significance connected to that specific point in the Earth's yearly cycle, the turning point from darkness back towards light.
And speaking of historical dates and figures, they make some extremely bold claims about the history of Christianity and Jesus himself.
They really do. This is probably one of the most controversial parts of these excerpts. The sources state quite directly, quite bluntly, that there are no facts in history concerning the birth of Jesus or Christ at the traditionally reputed time around year zero.
No historical facts.
That's their claim. They argue the terms Jesus and Christ actually existed and were used in mystery traditions centuries before that period. They also claim that contemporary historians of the supposed time, people like Philo or Josephus, presumably supposedly ignored or failed to mention the key events central to the Gospels, like Herod's alleged slaughter of the innocents, Pontius Pilate's sentence, and the resurrection itself. The only records, they contend, are the Gospels, which they don't consider objective history.
That is a radically different historical perspective than the conventional one.
It absolutely is. Based on this assessment, the reputed historical birth of Jesus is deemed not authentic by these sources and placed firmly in the category of myths and legends.
Why do they think the traditional story persists then?
They attribute its persistence purely to custom and habit, saying it was established by early church fathers and just carried on unquestioned. They even make the sweeping statement that the world has not believed in Christianity, in the sense of truly living its core teachings for nearly 2,000 years, nor does it today, in their view. They argue most self-proclaimed Christians don't actually live by the Sermon on the Mount, for example.
So they see it primarily as a belief system maintained by social custom rather than by lived experiential truth or solid historical fact.
That seems to be their critical perspective presented here, yes. However, it's important to note they don't dismiss Christianity entirely just because they doubt its historical narrative.
Oh, how so?
Well, while they argue it has less basis in verifiable historical fact than many other religions, they explicitly say this doesn't mean it's necessarily false, nor that all religions lacking historical proof are false. They apply the old esoteric saying, within every mythos there is a logos, meaning even within a myth or legend, there often lies a profound truth, a deeper meaning.
So the story might be myth, but it contains truth.
Exactly. And they claim Christianity's enduring strength actually lies in a secret power that has benefited believers over the centuries, even if they don't fully understand the historical origins or the deeper meaning. They don't elaborate much on what this secret power is, though.
So very complex perspective. Dismissive of the literal historical narrative is commonly told, but acknowledging a genuine spiritual power or truth within the tradition.
A very complex and nuanced perspective, yes. And they connect this idea of Christ not just to a historical figure, but to a state of being, a potential achievable through human evolution, the idea of becoming a Christ or achieving a second birth.
Something attainable by ordinary humans.
Yes, potentially. This process, they say, this inner transformation, is linked to the esoteric principles of the zodiac and is specifically connected to that time around December 25th when the sun is set to enter the sign of Capricorn in astrology.
Why that specific time?
This time, the winter solstice period, they claim, is when a human body, provided it has undergone intense and specific preparation, is best suited, astrologically and energetically, for this profound inner transformation to occur.
What kind of preparation are we talking about?
It's extremely demanding, according to the text. It includes absolute physical chastity, a highly trained and focused mind, completely controlled desires, and a perfectly sound physical body. Very few would qualify, presumably.
And if someone meets these stringent conditions?
If these preparations are successfully made, they say, then the seed of Christ, this divine potential, can take root within the person. This leads to the gradual building of an inner ethereal body. They actually call it the Jesus body, which is distinct from the ordinary astral body.
What's this Jesus body like?
It's described as being fully conscious on inner planes, inherently intelligent, wise, powerful, immortal, and possessing unbroken consciousness, even through physical death. It's essentially a transformation into a higher order of being.
It sounds like a state of enlightenment or apotheosis.
That's very much the sense of it. And finally, tying all this back into the Christian narrative, they offer a fascinating, purely allegorical interpretation of the Trinity and the entire Christian salvation story.
Okay, how do they interpret that allegorically?
God the Father, they say, allegorically represents the higher mind, the immortal divine consciousness within each person. The Savior, or God the Son, is then a portion, a ray, of this higher mind, essentially the lower incarnating mind, that is sent to enter and live in the human mortal man for a period, for a lifetime.
So the Son is the part of our own higher consciousness that incarnates within our personality.
That's their interpretation, yes. And when this incarnate mind eventually leaves the physical body, at death or potentially through achieving this second birth, it sends the Holy Ghost, also called the Comforter, or Advocate, which acts as a continuing helper or inner guide, perhaps the intuition or conscience refined. This incarnate mind, this ray, is the true Son of God, come to save that particular man from mortality, from death.
How does this saving happen in this allegory?
They explain that if the personal man, the everyday personality, has faith in and diligently follows the teachings, the word of this incarnate mind within himself, then he can progressively cleanse his body, both physical and subtle, stop sinning, acting against universal law through right action, and potentially keep his mortal body alive long enough for his soul, the psyche, the form body, to be fully redeemed and made immortal.
And this transformation process, this struggle,
Yeah.
is that the crucifixion?
That's precisely their allegorical meaning. The crucifixion represents the incarnate mind being willingly fixed or crucified upon the cross of flesh, the limitations and temptations of the physical body and mortal personality. By succeeding in this difficult process, the mortal aspect overcomes death and gains immortal life, ultimately becoming consciously one with the higher mind, the Father in heaven.
What if the person's faith fails? If they don't follow the inner guidance?
Then, they say, the incarnate mind is still crucified, but tragically it's crucified daily by the mortal personality's disbelief, doubt, and continued sinning. The potential for transformation is lost in that life.
And for the vast majority of humans who don't achieve this full transformation during life, What's their post-death process in this allegorical view?
The process is different then. The physical body dies. The descent into hell, in this interpretation, refers to the difficult post-mortem process where the mind must separate itself from the clinging carnal desires and attachments accumulated during life, the kama loka. The arising from the dead symbolizes the successful completion of this separation from the desire body. And the ascent into heaven represents the mind, now purified, entering the thought world to rest, review the past life, judging the quick and the dead within itself, and determine the conditions and lessons needed for its next descent into the world. That is, its next incarnation, with the ultimate ongoing goal of achieving enlightenment and final atonement, or at one-ment with its divine source. It's presented as a vast, cyclical process of evolution centered entirely on inner spiritual transformation.
Okay, let's wrap up this deep dive by looking at a final, slightly different section. Animals and humanity's relationship with them, according to these sources. And they start with a pretty strong, maybe even shocking stance, condemning the act of making idols out of animals or worshiping them, particularly pets.
Yeah, they view this extremely negatively. It's described as a serious abuse. Unfitting for the animal itself, degrading to any other humans who might be compelled or expected to serve the pet's needs above their own, and most seriously, an attempt to make a potential god, which is how they see the human, into a servant of a beast.
That's strong language. Are there consequences?
Oh, yes. They claim this has severe karmic consequences, stating it must be paid for in future lives, often through experiencing similar misery and degradation oneself. They even say few punishments are considered too severe for someone who elevates an animal above human dignity in this way.
Wow. That's an unusually strong condemnation, especially concerning pets.
It is very stark, yes. On a less controversial note, they also discuss the intriguing ability of hibernating animals to survive long periods with minimal food and air.
What's their explanation for that?
They state clearly that no animal lives completely without any food, but the need during hibernation becomes incredibly low. Respirations are minimal, slowed right down, but just enough, they say, to maintain contact with what they call life currents from the environment. The animals essentially live off stored energy, mostly fat. They even mention old newspaper examples, reports of toads and lizards supposedly found alive after being embedded in rock for centuries, suggesting survival under seemingly impossible conditions.
Which naturally leads them to ask, could humans do something similar?
Precisely. They pose the question directly. Can man learn to live without food and air for extended periods? They acknowledge that modern science of their time, and largely still today, denies this possibility, dismissing reports as anecdotal or fraudulent. But they cite what they call trustworthy witnesses, and even public records, supposedly existing in India, detailing instances of yogis who could suspend their bodily functions and live without breathing air for long periods through certain practices.
What are these practices supposed to involve?
The key, they say, is learning to connect with and consciously control the psychic breath, an inner life current, which apparently has the effect of stopping the physical breath safely. This state, they suggest, can sometimes happen unintentionally, perhaps triggered by an extreme mental state or deep hypnosis, or it can be achieved deliberately through specific willed effort.
Willed how?
Two main ways are mentioned for the willed approach, either through specific physical and breathing exercises, like pranayama, presumably, or through pure mental control, becoming independent of sensory input. The first method relies more on manipulating the inner senses or energies. The second relies purely on the power of the trained mind.
So they fundamentally believe that conscious control over these deep, usually autonomic life processes is possible for humans.
Yes, absolutely. Through specific, dedicated training. Finally, shifting slightly, they touch on human interaction with the plant kingdom, with growing things like plants, vegetables, fruits, flowers. They even offer advice on how someone might develop a completely new species or variety.
Really? How do you do that, according to these sources? Create a new plant species?
Well, the first step, they say, is you must clearly conceive of the new species in your mind. It requires intense, confident brooding like a hen on an egg, and highly focused thinking on the desired new form, its qualities, its characteristics.
So it starts entirely as a mental blueprint.
Entirely. They say you initially need little botanical knowledge, although you should learn the practical aspects as you go. But the absolutely crucial element they emphasize is that you must learn to feel with growing things. You must develop a genuine love for them.
Love them. like emotional connection.
Yes, exactly. Love them in order to truly know their ways, understand their needs, and get the best from them, whether that's nurturing existing plants or attempting to guide the life force towards creating something new. And they state quite broadly that this rule holds good through all kingdoms, implying that love, empathy, and deep feeling are essential for truly understanding and positively influencing any aspect of nature, not just plants.
Wow. That really was a deep dive into a truly unique and sometimes quite challenging set of ideas from these Moments with Friends excerpts.
It really is a remarkably comprehensive and distinct worldview they present, isn't it? We covered so much ground, their specific views on healing and payment, the layered nature of reality, that critical distinction between the mind and the soul, their detailed take on afterlife states and seances.
Not to mention karma, human potential being linked to thought creation, and even shaping animal forms, their interpretations of ancient symbols like the snake and eagle, and those radical claims about history and Christianity.
It's just fascinating how they weave together these seemingly disparate concepts. The link between healing practices and financial compensation, afterlife states explained through these desire forms at seances, or that really wild idea that human thought and desire can directly influence the physical forms of animals over time.
Yeah, they definitely don't shy away from challenging conventional views, whether it's on science, religion, or human capability. They present this really cohesive, if sometimes very complex, and let's face it, occasionally startling alternative perspective rooted in these esoteric ideas from over a century ago.
Definitely challenges you to think outside the usual boxes.
Absolutely. What stands out most to you personally from digging into all this? Is it maybe their sharp critique of certain healing practices or their layered and pretty non-conventional view of the mind versus the soul, that completely unexpected explanation for animal forms based on human desire, or perhaps their very, very different take on historical narratives?
It certainly makes you reevaluate a lot of assumptions, doesn't it? Puts things in a different light.
It really does. So here's a final thought from these sources for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. They say that when a man learns to train his physical body according to reasonable methods, his mind, almost as a side effect, becomes self-instructed. It learns mastery not only over the body, but also, crucially, over its own internal disquietude and restlessness. What might that specific connection, that interplay between discipline, physical training, and achieving mental mastery and peace mean for your own approach to mind and body integration?
Definitely something to ponder. Food for thought.
That's all for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some surprising facts, maybe some challenging ideas, and definitely some unique insights to consider from this particular historical perspective.